Thank you, Professor Chen. And thank you all for being here this morning at this early hour. I think it's fair to say we're about halfway through the conference now, and everything's been going very well. So everything is very well taken care of. So thank you also, a warm word of thanks to our local organizers and international organizers. So I'd like to begin today. Yeah, they deserve that. So I'd like to begin my talk by considering the theme of this conference, which is Pragmatics of the Margins. And the call for papers asks, how might those at the margins speak to the middle, speak back to the middle and be heard? Now, taking the margins to also include the academic margins, we can think of politeness as one topic that has successfully made the move from the margins to center stage. If the number of conferences, journal publications, also the sheer number of people working on politeness these days are anything to go by. Just to look at the panels, the number of panels at this conference. Now, that was not always the case. Politeness started out at the academic margins as an explanation for indirect speech acts. That's how John Searle talks about it in his 1975 article on indirect speech acts, where he proposes an inferential account of indirect speech acts building on Grice's cooperative principle. And this theme of politeness as motivating departures from the Gricean cooperative principle is taken up in the work of Robin Lakoff and Jeff Leach, who extended it to relate to different types of contexts in the case of Lakoff and different types of speech acts in the case of Leach. But probably the most complete proposal in this regard came from Brown and Levinson in their 1975 Politeness, Universals in Language Usage, that became Some Universals in Language Usage when it was reissued as a book in 1987. And in that work, Brown and Levinson are still aiming to account for indirect language behavior. As they say, they see politeness as a principled reason for deviation from the cooperative principle. But in doing so, they introduce face, a notion taken from the sociologist Irving Goffman, as well as, in their own words, the English folk term which ties face up with notions of being embarrassed or humiliated or losing face. And in introducing face into this literature, they set the foundations for true interdisciplinarity in this field. But I think that was a move that also had some further far-reaching consequences that they themselves may not have anticipated. And that is that in proposing to think of face as an explanation for politeness, they essentially moved the goal of politeness theories from being an explanation for indirect speech acts, as it had been for the early politeness theorists, to now be to account for how face, positive and negative, is constituted in conversation. And I think that's an important shift in the theoretical goalposts to consider for politeness studies, because it relates to a number of developments that followed more recently. That would be the rise over the past 15 or so years of the study of impoliteness, the distinction between first and second order politeness, and precisely the lack of agreement among both theoreticians and lay people about what politeness is, what Ehlen in 2001 called the discursive struggle over politeness. Also, more recently, a shift away from face itself in favor of the normative and illogical basis for politeness, and also the interface of emotions and impolite language use. Now, my own engagement with politeness studies started about the late 1990s when I chose politeness in Cypriot Greek as the topic of my PhD dissertation. There were not many works on politeness in Greek at the time, but Mary Siphianou's influential politeness phenomena in England and in Greece had appeared. And in that work, Siphianou made the claim that Greece is a positive politeness culture, building on a distinction between positive and negative politeness cultures made by Brown and Levinson. And she substantiated this claim about Greek being a positive politeness culture by pointing to, among others, the use of diminutives, which, as she successfully showed, are used in Greek not to lessen an imposition, but rather to express solidarity, endearment, cajolement, that is, to meet positive face needs. Now, by shifting the focus to Cypriot Greek, a regional variety of Greek that bears a relationship to Standard Greek similar to that of perhaps Flemish to Standard Dutch, or Swiss German to High German, I was shifting my focus to the margins 2 more times. Not only would I be researching politeness, a phenomenon at the time somewhat marginal to pragmatics, I would be doing so in Greek, a language that departed from the usual emphasis on avoidance of imposition of other cultures that had been studied until that time. And I would be doing so in a non-standard variety of that language. So 3 times at the margins. The pragmatics of non-standard varieties can be quite interesting in itself, because speakers of non-standard varieties have a choice between using the standard or the non-standard form, and whichever they use carries social connotations. So to do this, I also shifted the methodology from looking for data in plays and questionnaires, as Sifyanou had done, to recording spontaneous conversations in a variety of settings on the island of Cyprus, which is what's shown there. And that meant recording people in their homes, at their workplace, during leisure, or during radio and TV interviews. And what I found was perhaps not surprising in hindsight, but it did not fit within existing theoretical models. If Standard Greek did not seem to care much about avoiding imposition, that was Sifyanou's claim, or at least cared at least as much about expressing solidarity, Cypriot Greek did not seem to do any of those 2 things. The prevailing way of performing requests in context after context was the bare imperative, by which I mean the second person singular verb form. Diminutives and other mitigators were not much used, and the distinction, the tu vous distinction, which exists in Standard Greek, was only wielded in formal contexts during TV and radio interviews. So, in short, Cypriot Greek seemed to eschew all the usual signs of indirectness that had up until that point been associated with politeness. So how did speakers of Cypriot Greek express politeness? Did they care about it at all? Short of claiming that a lack of explicit signposting of politeness somehow amounts to a lack of interest in politeness, this is an important question to answer. This is where my methodology of having recorded spontaneous conversations in a variety of settings, essentially creating the first spoken corpus of Cypriot Greek annotated with social information about participants, came in useful. Although these corpus data are not controlled enough to allow for inferential statistics, descriptively summing over the preferences of pairs of interlocutors in different settings showed that when found in well-rehearsed contexts, contexts that we might, in the tradition of Chuck Fillmore, think of, in his tradition of scenes and frame semantics, think of as cultural scenes. So in these frequently recurring contexts, speakers tended to revert to the same expressions over and over again. So for instance, when speakers of working class tended to ask for goods entering a shop for the first time, they would say, "Is there X?" And speakers of middle class would use the expression, the equivalent Cypriot Greek expression, I'm just working with the English translations for ease here, "Do you, plural, have X?" And similarly, interviewees in formal interviews would ask for the floor by saying, "I would like to X," whereas the interviewers interviewing them would say, "I want to X." In all other contexts, including secretaries addressing their bosses, colleagues talking to each other, shopkeepers talking to customers, family members at home, friends at leisure, the bare imperative was the order of the day, tended to predominate. This finding prompted me to start thinking of politeness not as something that can be directly achieved between the speaker and the hearer by having the speaker recognize the hearer's intention to be polite, but rather as something that is socially mediated and that involves providing verbal evidence that the speaker is abiding by the interactional norms of the community of practice at hand, on the assumption that the hearer is also abiding by the same norms. So if the bare imperative was used so frequently and in so many situations among Cypriot Greek speakers, perhaps that fact by itself made it polite. That was the verbal evidence that the hearer needed to be provided with to think of the speaker as a cultural insider, the right way to do things in this community, and thereby also a hallmark of Cypriotness, being a Cypriot. On this account, politeness is not something that is consciously aimed at by interlocutors, but rather something that falls out naturally as a byproduct of behaving as expected under the circumstances. So in short, doing as the Romans do, or in our case as the Cypriots do, has distinct theoretical advantages, distinct interactional advantages. It provides evidence of the speaker's familiarity with certain ways of doing things, and it is displaying this familiarity that constitutes the speaker's face in the hearer's ears by showing to the hearer that he and the speaker share a value system. Note that this does not involve doing things in any specific way, for instance, adjusting one's level of indirectness to the sum of distance plus power plus ranking of imposition, as Brown and Levison have claimed, or expressing contents that give value to the hearer over the speaker, as Leach has claimed. Rather, constituting one's face in another's ears by displaying familiarity with certain ways of doing things involves doing things simply the way people like us do these things, whatever that way happens to be. So it can include speaking directly, if that's what's customary for a group of people at a certain place and time. No departure from the Gracian cooperative principle is required. It makes sense that rather than departing from the CP, something that has in any case been challenged in subsequent work in both L1 and L2 interaction and using various methodologies, politeness should build on the display of in-group belonging, because that allows more flexibility about what behaviors constitute face. If politeness is defined relative to face, and face is an image of self in terms of approved social attributes, then the kind of behavior that constitutes face can be expected to be variable across communities, since what's socially approved is also variable across communities. Note that this brings politeness close to the notion of identity, and that's the link that's been amply explored in the recent literature on impoliteness. Going back for this to the work of Lepage and Tabouret-Keller from 1985, because I think that's usefully complemented but not necessarily surpassed by more recent work, they define acts of identity as behaving according to the behavioral patterns of groups we find it desirable to identify with, and go on to list 4 constraints on our ability to do so. What interests me is the first part of this definition, because it talks about finding it desirable to identify with groups. And those 2 elements are highly reminiscent of Goffman's definition of face in terms of approved social attributes. In both cases, we have a reference to a positive evaluation and to something that's shared. And both identity and face come into existence as we go about our daily lives, making decisions, usually without realizing it, about what to wear, what to eat and how to eat it, what to say and how to say it. Note, that does not mean that face and identity are the same thing. Constituting our face in another's ears means, in the ears of some hearer, means securing the approval of that hearer. So the positive evaluation of our behavior comes from the hearer. But constituting our identity in the ears of the same hearer means that the hearer has to recognize what group we're trying to identify with, without them necessarily being a member of that group or approving of it. So the positive evaluation of the behavior comes from us. Now, coming back to face and staying close to the spirit of Goffman, the best way to increase our chances of being perceived as polite is to try and project social attributes that the hearer is likely to approve. And the best way of doing that is, the safest probably, is by staying close to the norms of the community that we believe we both belong to, since such norms by definition capture socially approved ways of doing things, and that increases chances that the hearer will approve as well, even if this is someone we haven't met before. So only on the assumption that they're a member of the same community, this is the safest path to take. The speaker need not have an intention to be polite, and the hearer need not recognize any such intention for this to happen. If the speaker's intention enters this picture at all, it's in case their utterance is different from what the hearer had expected under the circumstances, or because the situation itself is novel and there are no preset expectations about how to behave in it. Now, this last scenario, the situation being novel, can be the case in intercultural encounters. Of course, not all intercultural encounters are the same, and we have various degrees of knowledge about our interlocutors and desire to communicate with them. For our purposes, we may define intercultural encounters as encounters between people who have limited knowledge about the communities of practice the other belongs to, and yet have a desire to communicate. And I use communities in the plural here intentionally because we all claim belonging of different communities of practice, several ones, possibly foregrounding different ones at different times. So in the case of intercultural communities, that stock of shared repertoire of norms isn't there for the speaker to fall back on. So they need to make hypotheses about what kinds of social attributes the hearer might approve of. And in making these hypotheses, they're constrained by their awareness of the differences in what they and their interlocutor take for granted, their ability to modify their behavior, and their interest in doing so. This is a suite of attributes that are sometimes talked about under the umbrella of cultural metacognition. Now, of course, an ability to draw analogical extensions based on one's real-world knowledge is important to this. But cultural metacognition goes beyond that because it crucially involves knowing when not to make an analogical extension, when making such an extension would be unwarranted because even though it seems commonsensical from our point of view, it isn't so from the point of view of our intercultural partner. So I would think that this ability to sort of monitor our own thought process and know when we're making an analogical extension in the first place is possibly a sort of equivalent, a self-directed kind of epistemic vigilance. That's a notion that I'll come back to in a while. In any case, I think future studies of intercultural communication would do well to keep track of all dimensions of cultural metacognition because they're at least as important as linguistic proficiency, which is what's usually taken into account. After all, in assessments of politeness and impoliteness, we are trying to find out if our interlocutor shares some social attributes that we approve of rather than assess their level of lexis and grammar, which may be an individual attribute approved of. On their side, hearers faced with a new way of doing things will need to reason explicitly about why the speaker said things the way they did. And in doing so, they're likely to draw on their experience from similar situations, as well as what they know about this particular speaker. Are they a native speaker? Are they a nice person? And also temporally sensitive behavioral cues that the speaker themselves may provide, like smiling, a certain tone of voice, gestures, and so on. The hearer may end up thinking that the speaker is polite or not. In either case, this will have been the outcome of a more involved process. It's arguable that people in intercultural exchanges operate with this heightened degree of epistemic vigilance, switching from a more intuitive to a more reflective mode of reasoning as their abilities permit. And they do that both as speakers and as hearers. And if by a more reflective mode of reasoning, we mean the ability to think how else the speaker could have said what they said, and that is to call up alternatives and think metalinguistically about language, it's reasonable that our ability to think reflectively will also increase as our linguistic proficiency increases. So the two are not completely unrelated, just to temper what I just said about linguistic proficiency in intercultural communication. Now, it will have become obvious by now that I'm using polite in the second-order sense of the term, and that's different from the common meaning of polite in daily communication, its first-order sense. Specifically, I define politeness as all linguistic behavior seen through the lens of its potential to impact face, whether that is to enhance face or to threaten face. Both of those belong under politeness in my definition. Much like theories of performativity, look at language through the lens of its potential to bring about changes in the world. In other words, in politeness studies, there isn't a fixed set of strategies or expressions we're interested in a priori. All linguistic behavior can impact face. Our job, our task, is to find out how and why it does that. So the second-order definition of politeness also includes impoliteness, and it ties both politeness and impoliteness to face as a technical term, which is why throughout this talk I'll keep talking about politeness which I'm using as a superordinate second-order term to include also impoliteness, rather than using sometimes the more trendy im/politeness abbreviation. Now, it's important to acknowledge that all language behavior impacts face, because otherwise, face can become something that can remain unaffected by interaction, rather than something that's continuously brought into existence through interaction. And even what's sometimes called maintaining face, what Bob Arundale has called a stasis mode of constituting face, or Richard Watts's politic behavior, that also involves bringing about face. As Goffman wrote, a person tends to experience an immediate emotional response to the face which a contact with others allows him. If the encounter sustains an image of him that he has long taken for granted, he probably will have few feelings about the matter. But note that the exchange must first sustain an image of a person. Face must be brought into existence. That may go by undetected. It may generate few feelings. But unless we admit it's happening, we run the risk of turning face into something that can remain unaffected by interaction, an attribute that individuals can have outside of interaction. And this brings us to the following diagrammatic representation of the relationship between face 1, face 2, and politeness 1 and politeness 2. Starting at the bottom of this diagram, this box, somewhat cheekily called the domain of observable behavior. Here we have behavior that's explicitly talked of as polite or impolite. That would be politeness 1 or impoliteness 1. But there's also behavior that's thought of as appropriate, rude, and even metalinguistic talk about face that's recently been claimed not to relate to politeness also belongs here because it affects judgments about socially approved social attributes. So that also impacts face. Any behavior that impacts face belongs under politeness 2. Now, politeness 2 is the domain of face 1. Face 1 is the situated contents of face in different cultures. And because different communities approve of different social attributes, the contents of face 1 in different cultures will be different. And that means that also the scope of politeness 2 will cover different behaviors in different cultures. What remains stable is the fact that all of these behaviors in these different cultures somehow relate to face 1, impact face 1. At the top node of this diagram, we have face 2. Face 2 sums up what the different face 1s encountered across cultures have in common. This is, of course, an empirical question, and while we know quite a few things about what types of social attributes different cultures approve and disapprove of, there's few attempts to bring those together under a single umbrella. Here, too, the pace has been set by Brown and Levinson, and their distinction between positive and negative face. The contents of these two aspects of face have, of course, been amply debated, hotly debated, and adjusted in different cultures. But generally, a dual system seems to work quite well. And in my own work, I've drawn on the literature on emotions and the duality of positive versus negative affect to define face 2 as an innate tendency to approach or withdraw from an other. What I refrain from doing is hardwiring a hierarchical ranking between these two aspects of face. In Brown and Levinson's approach, negative face takes priority over positive face. Now, that may have been the case in the cultures that they analyzed, but I don't think it holds universally. I don't think we can universally say that negative face ranks above positive face. There's enough empirical evidence to suggest that which aspect of face, if any, takes priority, and I use if any because more often what seems to be the case is that they're both affected at the same time. So if one of them takes priority, that seems to be a highly variable matter, culturally, situationally, and even individually. There is recent work showing that even within the same community, there could be differences on that. So the domain of face 2 falls outside of observable behavior. That's why it's outside the box at the top of this diagram. Unlike face 1, which can guide behavior, face 2 has no psychological reality. It's purely a theoretical thing that we have come up with as a kind of grid to help us classify the commonalities, if any, among the face 1s that are the social attributes that are approved by different communities. Now, in the time that we have left, I'd like to explore some of the theoretical implications of this analysis for the field of pragmatics and linguistics more generally. And here I'll begin with the role of the hearer. Note that on the analysis that I just presented, politeness is not an implicature. It's not part of speaker's meaning. Rather, it is a perlocutionary effect of the speaker's utterance. Politeness is a belief held by the hearer that the speaker is polite. Of course, how the hearer comes to hold this belief is the crux of the matter, what we're here to explain. In this respect, I like to draw a distinction between two beliefs that the hearer can hold. The first is that the speaker is being polite, and the second is that the speaker is polite. I believe that politeness consists in holding this second belief. That's what it means to say that politeness is a perlocutionary effect of the speaker's utterance. The first belief, that the speaker is being polite, can help bring about the second, but it does not yet amount to politeness having been achieved. The hearer can think that the speaker is being polite without, for that matter, thinking that the speaker is polite. He can hold one belief without holding the other. That's why we can say things like these examples culled from the internet and novels that I'll quickly go over right now. I could tell that she was trying to be polite, but she had that look. Or I could tell he was trying to be polite, but there was the slight roll of his eyes, a flash of annoyance on his face. It seemed like he was trying to be polite, but there was an edge in his voice. Or, at the end of a conversation, I think he was trying to be polite, but only condescension was coming through. And what we have in these four examples is something in the speaker's delivery or paralinguistic behavior preventing the hearer from thinking that the speaker is polite, despite having attributed a polite intention to the speaker. And there are other examples in which the same thing happens. The hearer holds back from thinking that the speaker is polite, despite having recognized the speaker's polite intention. But now it's the difference in social values that seems to prompt that result. The first comes from a genderless people's blog. And someone wrote, "Someone phoned my home earlier today and called me mom. She was trying to be polite, but it backfired because I'm not a woman." Or from an adoptive parent's blog, "Now, I know this woman likely did not know how not okay this question is to ask an adoptive parent. She was trying to be polite, but in her attempts to be correct, this mama felt a bit slammed." Trying to be polite, in this last example, means attributing to the speaker a wish to be polite, an intention to be polite. Feeling a bit slammed, despite this recognition, means that the speaker has, for whatever combination of reasons, ended up hurting the hearer's feelings, and thereby damaging the hearer's face and also her own face in the hearer's eyes. In today's parlance, we may describe the difference between these two situations in terms of epistemic vigilance, a notion recently elaborated on by Dan Sperber and his colleagues, who explained that there is a difference between deriving an implicature from the speaker's utterance, in our case the proposition that the speaker is being polite, and accepting that implicature as true, in our case the proposition that the speaker is polite. And they furthermore claim that acceptance of the implicature as true has a lot to do with how we feel about the source of the information, the speaker. What the last two examples from the genderless people's blog and the adoptive parents blog show is that attributing to the speaker an intention to be perceived as polite is not enough for the hearer to think that the speaker is polite. The hearer can still reject that second belief because they evaluate behavior differently from the speaker. What's right for the speaker is not right for the hearer, is not necessarily the right way of doing things for the second person. And once that discrepancy becomes apparent, politeness can be impossible to achieve. The approved social attributes that the speaker wishes to project are not approved by the hearer, and vice versa. We may have reached here the limits of politeness. What I earlier called the contents of phase one are different for the speaker and for the hearer. The two are dancing to a different tune. So this means that achieving politeness can be blocked at any time and for whatever reason. Politeness as a perlocutionary effect of the speaker's utterance can never be guaranteed. Even when the speaker has used the right words in the right context, politeness can still fail to materialize in the ears of the hearer because of contrary indications in the speaker's current or past behavior, or because the hearer is attributing to the speaker some assumptions that the hearer disagrees with. Understanding politeness as a perlocutionary effect of the speaker's utterance makes politeness very much an interactional achievement of the speaker and the hearer taken together. But herein also lies a danger, and it is to this danger that I'd like to turn now by considering the speaker's role. So, is anything left for the speaker here to do? In fact, by placing politeness in the ears of the hearer, the danger is that we take it away completely from the mouth of the speaker. Some politeness theory has claimed just that, some politeness theorizing, that since politeness does not reside in what the speaker does or says, it can be pointless to try and identify patterns of polite behavior, of polite linguistic behavior, since there's no way for speakers to know in advance how their words will be taken. And it is this same optionality in interpretation that led Brown and Levinson to claim that politeness must be communicated, and the absence of communicated politeness may, all else being equal, be taken as absence of the polite attitude. Both of these approaches make politeness a matter of situated local interpretation, a matter of particularized conversational implicature. Now, this line of thinking fails to explain the Cypriot Greek results for a different reason. Recall that in well-rehearsed contexts that we might call cultural scenes, such as being a first-time customer in a shop or being interviewed on radio or TV, speakers of Cypriot Greek tended to revert to the same linguistic expressions over and over again. If speakers do not make predictions about how their words will be taken, then why do they keep opting for the same linguistic expressions in these contexts, rather than for a general level of indirectness, as Brown and Levinson have suggested? Why, that is, do Cypriot Greek speakers of working class ask for goods during service encounters by saying, "Is there X?" while speakers of middle class in the same situation say, "Do you plural have X?" Why aren't these two expressions interchangeable? And if conversely speakers do make predictions about how their words will be taken, what are these predictions based on? Steve Levinson has most clearly made the point that language forms can also communicate meaning, not in virtue of the speaker's intention, but because of how they're normally used. He has, after Grice, called this meaning generalized conversational implicatures, and it is this notion of GCI that I think can be useful in understanding how speakers choose among seemingly equivalent expressions to do things with words on a daily basis. Now, on Levinson's and Larry Horn's very similar scheme, there's a type of generalized conversational implicature that Levinson calls I implicature and Horn calls R implicature that generate inferences to the stereotype. Stereotypes draw on our knowledge of the world, so they can be different for different people. But once a stereotypical way of doing something has been established, other ways of doing the same thing sound marked. They will attract attention and call for an explanation. For instance, in some places, such as the Netherlands, passengers on public transport greet drivers upon entering and exiting the bus. And that happens also in some other places in the world. But in other places, as in Greece until at least recently, buses carry a sign, "Do not speak to the driver." If you find yourself in the first kind of place and fail to greet the driver, you can be perceived as impolite. This is a scene of omission, a little research category that has a lot to teach us about what's expected in different parts of the world. But unfortunately, I can't go into that now. But there is a crucial difference between the classic notion of generalized conversational implicature and the one I think we need in politeness research. Traditionally, GCIs are attached to expressions directly. Because they are derived in normal circumstances, once an expression is encountered, assuming there are no indications to the contrary, the GCI goes through, the implicature goes through. But communities of practice, as I have been calling cultures, differ widely in what they take to be normal. They differ in both the situations that they recognize as cultural scenes, so in the Netherlands, entering and exiting the bus can be such a scene, and in what they expect to happen during such scenes. In the Netherlands, that would be greeting the bus driver. Unlike the classic notion of GCI, GCIs of politeness must somehow delimit what counts as normal circumstances each time. That is, they must incorporate a reference to context. Speakers use linguistic expressions assuming they're polite under the circumstances. Passengers in the Netherlands greet bus drivers, but not train drivers, even when they see them on the platform. And that can be further relativized to different means of public transport, bus versus tram versus train, and the the size of the city. So speakers, in this respect, seems to have some knowledge about when and to whom, with whom to use these expressions. And it is this knowledge that we want to tap into. What we need here is a way of attaching a GCI of politeness, not to expressions directly, but to expression context combinations. And this is where the notion of a frame comes in. Informally, we may think of a frame as a holistic representation or gestalt of a situation, combining linguistic and extra-linguistic information in a single data structure stored in memory. Frames are formed by repeated exposure to a situation, so they are schematic representations abstracted over experienced ones. This way of thinking about frames is, of course, influenced, derived from a long tradition in cognitive linguistics and artificial intelligence research back to the 1970s in the work of Minsky and Schank and Abelson, as well as more recent work on exemplar models, for instance, by Per Humbert in phonology and morphology, and by John Bybee in construction grammar. There are four central ideas to exemplar models. First, there's a link between perception and cognition, such that perceptual stimuli experienced together are stored together. And every time they're experienced together again, this link is strengthened. Second, memory for linguistic experience is like memory for other types of experience. Each token of experienced linguistic behavior has an impact on cognitive representation. And remember, this includes all aspects of the stimulus, linguistic and extra-linguistic. So memory for linguistic experience includes different detailed information about the form and the contexts of previously processed linguistic stimuli. And finally, cross-domains links between form, meaning, and contexts, since what matters is that they're experienced together, are paired directly without intermediate representations. Because of this close link between perception and cognition, if people's experience of the world is similar, their repertoires of frames will be similar. And once a link has been established between the linguistic and extra-linguistic parts of a frame, one part can activate the other directly. There is no need for an intermediate formula such as Wx, the weightiness of a FTAX, equals the sum of the distance, the power, and the ranking of the imposition to calculate the right expression to use based on the type of context that one finds themselves in. But what about the two parts of the frame? The extra-linguistic information in a frame picks out dimensions of context regularly associated with certain linguistic expressions. So in the case of the expressions from Cypriot Greek that we've seen, is there X by working class customers, and do you plural have X by middle class customers? The setting, the commercial setting, the relationship being a lack of familiarity, and the class, working, or middle seem to be the dimensions of extra-linguistic information that are most closely, most relevant for constituting these expressions, both as requests in Cypriot Greek, note that this isn't something that's encoded in their semantics, and as polite requests in Cypriot Greek. Ideological, professional, religious, or other ethnic categories could be more relevant for some expressions or for some communities of practice than class or gender categories. Briefly, whatever emic categorizations tend to be recognized in a community of practice can be picked up as part of a frame and associated with certain ways of speaking. In fact, their being indexed linguistically is one of the ways, certainly not the only way, or the argument would be circular, in which these extra-linguistic categories are brought into existence and made relevant to language use. The categories that co-constitute the extra-linguistic part of a frame need not be the same for all expressions, which means our methodology must keep track of all extra-linguistic information that may be potentially relevant in order to find out, through tracking frequencies of co-occurrence in the data, which extra-linguistic information is actually relevant to which expressions. Now, as far as the linguistic expressions go that are associated with these extra-linguistic categories in a frame, what matters is not so much what the linguistic expressions mean, but the sheer fact that they're uttered and how, including their intonational contour and potentially other phonetic detail. To capture this, we need a bare-bones notion of locutionary what is said, similar to that defended in several publications by Kent Bach, whereby what matters is the fact that the speaker uttered certain words, putting them on the record rather than leaving them implicit in what she said. What does the work in this case is the form of the expression, the signifier, rather than what it means, what's signified. So we don't need to be actively communicating, avoiding imposition or expressing solidarity to be perceived as polite. Rather, what we have is an interaction between frequency of occurrence and phase constituting, as exemplar theorists have described it, so that each time the frame is accessed in either encoding or decoding, its phase constituting potential is reconfirmed. Relevance theorists might describe this as a reduction in the effort needed to process previously encountered stimuli, whereas in my own work I've described this as conventionalization, which I see as a three-way relationship between an expression, a language user, and a context. This treating of linguistic expressions as forms opens up fascinating new avenues for investigating the power of words as signifiers and all the rich and complex meanings they bring along with them, quite independently of the speaker's intention and the expression's semantic meaning. This is a dimension that's often overlooked in the mentalizing literature on implicatures and speech acts, only occasionally captured in anthropological linguistic work on indexicality. Possibly what comes closest to it is older analysis of magical language that put the emphasis on language as performative, bringing about changes in the world, whereas the propositional or referential functions can remain obscure to the direct users. Let us take stock. I started my talk by pointing out that my work is placed 3 times at the margins: the academic margins with politeness, the margins of more frequently studied avoidance imposition cultures with Greek, and the margins of a standard language with Cypriot Greek. So what has this focus on the margins shown us? First, it's shown us that politeness is above all a matter of sharing some interactional norms and of providing the hearer with verbal evidence of such norms. Intention recognition is not required and not enough for the hearer to think that the speaker is polite. Making politeness a matter of norms has several theoretical advantages. First, it allows different behaviors, including speaking directly, to be perceived as polite, which does justice to the several ways in which people constitute phase cross-linguistically. Second, it acknowledges that phase constituting, much like identity construction, is always taking place in interaction, even though it's hardly ever its primary goal. So it can go by below the radar. Thirdly, it accounts for those cases where the speaker can fail to come across as polite, even though their intention to be polite has been recognized. And that reminds us that politeness can never be achieved completely outside of some socially, mutually approved social attributes. And this might place some limits on the extent to which politeness can be achieved in intercultural communication. A second point I try to answer concerns the type of theoretical framework best equipped to account for politeness understood in this way. I've argued that a frame-based approach is best for that. Frames combine linguistic and extra-linguistic information in the same schematic representation, abstracted over real encounters, and embody evaluation by default. Positive evaluation is inferred from the fact that the expression and its context are experienced together, making superfluous a formula for calculating one based on the other. This conception of frames draws an exemplar theory and aligns politeness with ideas about mental architecture and about the structure of language systems pursued in other areas of linguistics. And the final question I briefly address concerns what level of linguistic representation is involved in politeness assessments. I argue that above all it is the form of expressions that participates in politeness, while what they mean semantically, their propositional meaning, can be relatively inert in this regard. That signifiers can index social meaning directly has been demonstrated for phonological units, is the basic idea in Lebovian sociophonetics, and recently also for words and their component morphemes, which can trigger associations about the speaker's gender. That signifiers above word level can also do that, signifiers like the lexicogrammatical constructions preferred by Cypriot Greek speakers that we saw today, aligns politeness with this sociolinguistically oriented work, opening up fascinating avenues for investigating the connections between society, cognition, and language. Thank you.